Palmyra, New York, a young village on the newly built Erie Canal, a young prophet named Joseph Smith, and a young enterprising printer named Egbert B. Grandin. All of this for the bringing forth of an ancient record, the printing of the Book of Mormon.
Normally in those days, people only printed a few hundred copies of a book. And to print 5,000 was extraordinary.
Coming up next on the Joseph Smith Papers.
KJAZ Television, in cooperation with the Church History Department of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, presents this weekly series highlighting the research of scholars and historians as they prepare for the publication of the Joseph Smith Papers. And now your host, Glenn Rawson.
With the translation of the Book of Mormon now accomplished and the copyright secured, Joseph set out to have the book printed. Now, have you ever thought about the immensity of this project? They're on the western frontier. Joseph has a 600-page book, and he wants 5,000 copies. Well, there probably was no man better prepared for the project than young Egbert B. Grandin right there in Palmyra.
Egbert Grandin, the printer, his brother Philip, and two twin brothers, Joel and Levi Thayer of Palmyra, went together and purchased this property from the state of New York. And then in 1828 had this 4-bay block, this 3-story high brick structure constructed. With the plans for the Erie Canal to pass through this area, entrepreneurs certainly anticipated that there would be growth in this village. And right up here on the 3rd floor, this book goes to press. And in that roughly 6-month period from August until March of 1830, the Book of Mormon is at press. But here in this little place in America, this mushrooming village, comes forth this work which has this tremendous responsibility to help carry the plan of salvation to the nations of the earth, this Book of Mormon.
Egbert Grandin had agreed with Joseph Smith and Martin Harris to print it. It took a little bit of persuading because by then rumors were out about this gold Bible, and some residents in and around Palmyra were starting to say they'd boycott the book if Grandin printed it. So he didn't want to, but when Joseph got a printer in Rochester to agree to do it, then came back and said, well, we're going to do it anyway, Grandin, you might as well. Then Grandin was willing to take the money and take the risk on the project. Martin Harris mortgaged his home and part of his farm to pay for the publication of the Book of Mormon, and it was quite a big project, very ambitious print run for that time and place, really. John Gilbert set the type.
Milton W. Hamilton, in his work, The Country Printer, New York State, 1785 to 1830, put the accomplishment in perspective when he stated, "Two outstanding publishing events occurred in western New York in the period 1785 to 1830. The first was the printing of William Morgan's Revelation of Masonry in the office of David C. Miller in Batavia, 1826. The second was the publication of the Book of Mormon, or the Golden Bible of Joseph Smith, by E.B. Grandin."
Now, Grandin was ambitious, and more importantly, he was capable. But that's not to say that he didn't have reservations about this project.
Henry Allen, a grandson of E.B. Grandin, said, "My grandfather at first refused. After consulting friends who felt it was merely a religious matter and that he would be in no way related to the religion, he finally consented." Pomeroy Tucker said it was a hard sell, that E.B. Grandin was concerned that there was a fraud afoot and that he would be defrauding the public as well as his friend Martin Harris.
Wisdom often comes from hard experiences, and Joseph had had a few of his own. The loss of the 116 pages had taught Joseph that another copy of the manuscript should be made before the printing process began.
Now, let's talk a little bit about the 1830.
Okay.
Now, as I mentioned, to do the printing of the 1830 edition, Joseph Smith instructed them to make a copy of the original manuscript. And Oliver Cowdery started doing this in August of 1829, and he prepared the first 24 pages, and they took it in. We did discover, as Oliver would copy, he made about 3 textual changes per manuscript page as he copied. And when I say that, it includes a deletion of an or an addition of a the. It includes, the most minor kinds of things, but we include those as changes. Virtually every one of them are accidental. There are a few places where he would read the printer's manuscript, didn't make sense, and he'd make a correction, and the original has the same. It doesn't make sense, so he'd correct both. He did that, though, probably I would say at most 10 times. I mean, that's the whole, very rare. Most of the time, he's just copying, and he's accidentally making errors. And the first thing they did before Joseph Smith went back to Pennsylvania was to set up the type for the title page. And when they set up the type, they just actually did the title page alone, and they ran off some copies. And these are called proof sheets, because there are going to be typos and various things in them. And we actually have a copy of the original proof sheet of the title page. And when we actually, if you go through this, you'll find that there are a number of typos. For instance, thereof is spelled therehoff. There's an H instead of an E. It's down there. And then confounded is coy-founded, and house is houso. There's all these typos. But that's what happens when the typesetter sets it. And then they look it over carefully. They find these errors, and then they correct them, and then they start the press run. Now, in this particular case, they hadn't done the other. There would have been 15 other pages that they would have done. And typically, when they would print them, this is sort of what it would look like. When you would have 16 pages in, I guess we could put that there.
Put that right up there.
And you could see it. In fact, we'll put it this way because there's the actual corrected title page. And if you go through here, you'll notice, in fact, let's put the other one up right beside it. And we can see a lot of sort of differences. So, for example, with the leading, they've increased it as the spacing between the lines has been increased.
Right.
And so it's brought down here further. But this, I think, Junior, you can see Junior has got double N, and they caught that error, and so they corrected it and so forth.
Right.
This is called a proof sheet. With a proof sheet, you would typically check it against the manuscript to make sure it's as accurate as possible. And then they would start the press work. And so, but what was interesting was that first day they just did the title page and they handed out copies of it. And Stephen Harding was there, and he later donated his copy to the church. And sometime after that, he was one of the territorial governors for Utah. And never joined the church as far as I know, but he did donate his copy, and there's his signature and so forth, and he gave it, and we're glad to have it, because this is then a proof sheet of what took place. So that's the proof sheet. And we distinguish between the proof sheet and then the corrected regular sheets that are coming off. Now, after they would start the press work, and they have to actually they have to end up with 5,000 copies. And when they would do this, they would actually have a larger, twice as large, and the other 8 pages that are on this other side would actually be out here. So they would do all 16 pages, and they'd go through 2,500 sheets. Then when they were done, they would go back and do the other side. They'd turn them around, each sheet, and lay it the other side, and print the other side of it. So you get 2,500 more copies. Then they would cut it. When they were going to come to put it into to bind it, they would cut these. So you would end up with 5,000 copies. And this is how they're able to actually do 5,000 copies in about 8 months. But after they would start the regular press work, the typesetter would sit down and just go through his copy, not checking against the manuscript, and would look for typos or punctuation errors and things, would mark them. And after he had gone through it, he would stop the press. This is called an impress change. And they would go in then and try and they would correct these typos. And this is called an impress change. Now, if you've done about 10% of the 2,500, you've got about 250 sheets already printed. Mm-hmm. Do you throw those away? No. This is expensive stuff.
Right.
So what you can find is that in an 1830 edition, such as this one, it turns out you have 37 sheets like this.
Okay.
And they're all put together and bound. And some of the sheets have uncorrected states, and some of them have corrected states. Usually there's about 3 or 4 signatures. There are 37 in here of these big sheets, and about 3 or 4 of them will be in an uncorrected state, and all the rest will be corrected.
In the middle of a press run then, the printer would stop and correct the error. Now the end result of this would be that for that verse, some copies of the 1830 Book of Mormon would be corrected and others would contain the original error.
Now what this means is, I've examined 100 copies of the 1830.
I didn't know there was that many out there.
Oh, there's at least 500 and maybe 700, the estimates have been made.
Okay.
Because it's the first edition, people have saved them.
Okay.
And so there's quite a few. And in any event, I've examined 100 or so in public sort of accessible places so that people can go check my work. But I have yet to find 2 copies that are the same. Because
you mean all the way through?
The impress changes, yes.
Okay.
So you'll have an impress change in one copy on a certain side of the page and not on the others. And so when you end up looking at a given copy, there'll be some pages that have uncorrected states and others that have corrected. Now, a lot of people have accused the typesetters for the 1830 because they didn't believe the Book of Mormon was the Word of God. They thought it was some kind of fraudulent thing that this Joseph Smith farmer boy was foisting on everyone. Mm-hmm. But they were always very proud of their work, and they did their best that they could do. There are quite a few typos, and people have complained about those. But whenever they found typos, they tried to correct them. In fact, there's one of these sheets, one of these signatures, they stopped the press 5 times. So there are 6 states. But in any event, this shows, too, that these individuals were trying their hardest to produce an accurate copy of the Book of Mormon. They did make mistakes. They were a small press. In fact, normally in those days, people only printed a few hundred copies of a book. And to print 5,000 was extraordinary. In fact, that's one of the reasons why many of the printers weren't really too happy about undertaking such a project, because their press would be used for such a long period of time
tied up
on this kind of thing. One of the interesting things that happened, as they were printing the book, they decided to set aside sheets like this, one for each of the 37 signatures that would be in the final copy, without binding them.
Dr. Skousen discovered pencil marks on the original manuscript where John Gilbert, the typesetter, had corrected the punctuation. The problem was they shouldn't have been there. They should have been on the printer's manuscript. So how do we explain that?
This was one of the biggest shocks, actually, of working on this, is to discover that Oliver Cowdery and Hiram Smith and Martin Harris took in the original. I guess they weren't supposed to do this. But they did do it. It was about 3/4 the way through. Apparently they didn't think there was any problem with losing it. I think by then they were always taking it home each night. The evidence seems to suggest that. I think at about 2nd Nephi in the Isaiah portions, they did let John Gilbert, the typesetter, take it home, and he marked it up with ink. It was Isaiah portions, but generally speaking, they were taking it home. So I think they felt secure in doing this. I discovered this initially when Glenn Rose showed me a fragment from 2 Nephi 26 and 27 that the church has. And here's this original piece of the original manuscript. It's a fragment. It's got pencil marks on it. And the pencil marks are assigned, this is what the typesetter had in front of him, because there is no punctuation, basically, in the text originally, and it has to be added by the typesetter. And so I looked at Glenn, I says, where did you get this? You know, this can't be part of the printer's manuscript. It's intact, you know. And but by then I had sort of figured out that it looks like they must have been taking in the original.
The Book of Mormon was famous locally before it was ever printed. People had heard about it and they wanted to know. Now, some of them were angry and others were merely curious. At any rate, there was one fellow who found a way to capitalize on this heightened sense of public interest.
During the time it's in press, a fellow named Abner Cole, who sometimes goes by the alias Obadiah Dogberry.
Nice name.
Yeah, that's a good pen name. He pilfers some of the passages of it. He writes a newspaper and prints a newspaper on the weekends in Grandin's print shop. So while everybody else is out for the weekend, he's in there making this a newspaper, the Palmyra Reflector. And so he, looking for copy, steals a couple of pages of the Book of Mormon and sticks them into his newspaper. Well, it upsets Joseph, as you might imagine. Joseph asserts his copyright. It almost comes to blows. Abner Cole wants to fight Joseph. So it didn't come to violence, but Cole was stopped. Joseph stopped him from putting any more passages in. And so then he would satirize it, the Book of Pukey he wrote. And it was kind of a mock version of the Book of Mormon.
There was a boycott by the sectarians in the area, both here and over in Seneca County. Devastating. A book that sold for $1.75 initially, then went for $1.25. But nevertheless, those copies of the Book of Mormon went out and went up as far as Canada and into St. Lawrence County and carried into Ohio and elsewhere by our missionaries. And they, in effect, were like a sleeping time bomb as they were placed and went off in households, such as that of Phineas Young and Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball, and the Murrays and the Greens and others. And the church grew and prospered because people read the Word, and the book is its own best witness.
That boycott only had local effect, enough so that Martin Harris was forced to sell part of his farm. The book, however, was so widely distributed that Palmyra in 1830 would not be Joseph Smith's only opportunity to edit and publish the Book of Mormon.
Let's just look here at some of the other editions that were published during Joseph Smith's lifetime. Two of the editions, Joseph Smith was actively involved in them, and mostly with editing. The first one we have here is the 1837. This is an edition published in Kirtland. The church printed it themselves. This is unusual for the church because usually they were having others do the printing of Book of Mormon.
I think it's important that as we try to ascertain what the prophet Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery were doing in making adjustments to the text in the Book of Mormon, that we visit a very important little passage in the preface to the second edition of the Book of Mormon, the 1837 edition, where they explain what they are doing. They're not trying to hide the process that they're going through. They're trying to illuminate for the reader what they're doing to the text. Individuals acquainted with book printing are aware of the numerous typographical errors which always occur in manuscript editions. It is only necessary to say that the whole has been carefully re-examined and compared with the original manuscripts by Elder Joseph Smith, Jr., the translator of the Book of Mormon, assisted by the present printer, Brother O. Cowdery, who formerly wrote the greatest portion of the same as dictated by Brother Smith.
Actually, what Joseph Smith did mostly for this edition is remove a lot of the bad grammar, what would be considered non-standard at least. So, and even he removed biblical bad grammar. That is, for instance, our Father which art in heaven. Today we would want to, that's the way the King James Bible reads, our Father which art in heaven, but we expect our Father who art in heaven. So for this edition, if you go back to that portion of it, you'll see our Father who art in heaven.
It's interesting you point that out because I see that dovetailing with his work on the Joseph Smith translation. He made a lot of those same corrections in the JST.
That's right. In the JST, he was making grammatical corrections, much like what he did for this, the second edition of the Book of Mormon. And so this is a very valuable Book of Mormon to show Joseph Smith's editing. One thing you'll notice here also in the early editions, including the 1830, the testimony of the witnesses, the three witnesses and the eight, is at the end.
Oh, yeah.
Only later were the witness statements moved to the front. But in the early editions, they're all at the end.
When Joseph called the Book of Mormon the most correct of any book on earth, he wasn't talking about grammar and punctuation. In 1837, Joseph published the Book of Mormon again and took that opportunity to correct some of the errors that had come in due to transcription and printing. He also modernized some of the English. Now, it was at this time that he made one of his most famous changes in the Book of Mormon, and it came to pass.
So this is the 1837, and it has thousands of grammatical changes. Most part, there are a few which are more stylistic, but most of them are grammatical changes.
Is there any substance to that Joseph just took out some of the "and it came to passes"?
He did take out about 44, I think, 40-some of them.
Also, that is true then. He did take
He
some of
did
those.
take some of them out. You know, it's interesting, though, those 40-some that he took out were ones that tended to be redundant. So he would have something like, the angel spake to Alma. It came to pass the angel spake to Alma, and it came to pass that Alma turned around. It came to pass that Alma went back to the city. There's something like that. And what's interesting about that, though, is that in the King James Bible, you don't have such repetitions like that, but in the original Hebrew, you do. This kind of excessive use. Actually, in the Hebrew, it's vayahi, and it means something like "and then." And it is used in this excessively redundant way in the Hebrew. Now, the King James translators thought, we're not going to put all those in there, so they would cut out some of them. And it's interesting, the original text of the Book of Mormon is like the Hebrew. It's got excessive use, really excessive use of "and it came to pass." And Joseph Smith edited the text towards what the King James would have. Okay, let's look at the next edition. This is the 1840. It was printed in Cincinnati. Ebenezer Robinson took an 1837 that Joseph and him had worked through. And Joseph had made more corrections of various kinds. And then he took an 1837 with him to Cincinnati to have this company print the actual copy. But when they produced this particular Book of Mormon, they produced it from what are called stereotyped plates. This was a new kind of system. See, when you normally do typesetting, you've got to set all the type. You don't have enough type to set the whole book, so you set a certain number of pages. You run off the pages.
The proof sheet procedure.
Yes, and then when you're done with the 5,000 copies, say, of the 1830, you break up the type. You distribute it, put it back in the cases, and then the typesetter starts a new group of pages because you don't have enough type to leave it all set up. So what they came upon was a system where you would set up the type, and for each page, then you could create, using a papier-mâché process, by pressing it on, you could get a copy of the whole set page.
And keep it.
And then, no, you actually wouldn't keep the papier-mâché. You would immediately take it and pour lead into a mold to create a whole sheet, not of individual type anymore, but of one whole sheet, or a page. And so you'd have a stack of all these individual pages all single lead. And so this is the way this was done.
I see.
So they printed off an impression of probably a couple thousand copies, and then Robinson took the plates that had been prepared to Nauvoo. And then over the next few years, they'd run out of copies, they would print more from these stereotyped plates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so this was the 1840. This one we could check, but it looks like it's an actual one that was released in Cincinnati. I'd have to check some of the details. But one of the plates got a little defect in it as they were being transported. So anything printed actually in Nauvoo has this defect at one place, so you can tell.
Okay.
We'd have to look at it more closely. But when you came to the last impression, they were going to use these plates in 1842, and Joseph Smith redid the title page.
Oh, he did.
And everything else in here is the same as this. It's coming from the Stereotyped Plates, the 1840. But he redid the title page. And the one thing which he did was to call it a new edition, which it really wasn't. It's an additional impression, but he says it's 1842. And interestingly, he decided to just put translated by Joseph Smith, not Jr. In the 1837, he had translated by Joseph Smith, Jr.
Okay.
But his father died, if I recall, in late 1840.
Right.
And so in those days, when you were a junior, you became a senior, basically, or you got rid of the junior when your father died.
I
So
see.
we see him doing this in the 1842. This is a fairly rare edition because of this title page being changed.
Ah.
And but later, we went back to putting the junior in. And the reason we did this was that in the witness statements, it distinguishes between Joseph Smith Jr. and Joseph Smith Sr.
We've seen then how diligent Joseph Smith and others were in bringing forth the Book of Mormon and in getting it out to all the world. Now in our next show, the first biographer in the church, Lucy Mack Smith.
The history she writes is the history of her family and also the history of persecution of her family for the gospel's sake.
That's next week on the Joseph Smith Papers. I'm Glenn Rawson. Thanks for joining us.